Welcome to Porch Play Chat, sponsored by the American Association for Promoting the Child's Right to Play, or more affectionately named IPA-USA. IPA-USA is the USA affiliate of the International Play Association, comprised of 23 different countries, all focused on advocating for the child's right to play. To learn more about IPA-USA, you can visit our website at IPA-USA.org. And up in the top right-hand corner, you can subscribe to our YouTube channel and be a friend on our Facebook page. As part of our efforts to advocate for play, we're introducing these Porch Play Chats, which are conversations with experts that are just as passionate about play as we are. Today on the porch, I am honored to have Dr. Edward Klugman. Dr. Klugman was born and raised in Nuremberg, Germany during Hitler's regime and underwent many traumatic experiences at 13 years, including Kristal Nacht and leaving Germany on a kinder transport to England 5 days before World War II. 7 months later, his family was in the US, and they earned their livelihood in US by making, okay, and I'm not going to pronounce it right, even though I lived in Germany for 3 years, LEBKUCHEN, which are German spice cookies. And when he became a baker, he later returned to Europe as an American soldier at 18 and became an interrogator of prisoners of war. Dr. Klugman has spent his professional career in the field of education with a focus on improving the quality of life for children and families as a teacher, administrator, researcher, and policymaker and author. He's worked in the total spectrum of education from birth and early childhood to later childhood, administering schools and higher education. So Dr. Klugman, we are so happy to have you. And I wanted to start because you've done so much in the field of early childhood education. I was wondering if you could talk to us about your history as a child and how that sort of guided you into being an advocate for play and for children.
Okay, now I wanted to start with really the overall effect of the politics that surrounded me and the politics that prevented me from the sandbox and neighborhood and how fear was pumped into all children, in particular Jewish children or children who were discriminated against, like gypsies who lived down the street from me in wagons that I loved to go visit, but people wouldn't let me because you don't do that. Gypsies are not wanted here. I knew one Black person, and she sold stationery at a wonderful stationery store, and we as kids would go in just to see her. We wouldn't buy anything, but we wanted to look at her. She was so different. She was Black. And she was the only Black woman that I knew. no black family did I
Mm.
know
Mm.
in Germany. So I also was going to spend time on energy transfer. As an older person, I had a valve situation. I didn't know that there were pig's valve and kosher valves.
Mhm.
And I got a new valve. But before I got the valve, I belonged to a men's group in Boston.
Mhm.
And the men's group asked me to describe myself. And I described not myself, but myself going into the hospital.
Mm.
And one of the men who was a valve surgeon came to my bedside at night
Mhm.
after he heard my story and told me the success of patient of his with valve surgery.
Which really helped you, right? And reassuring you that things were going to be good. Can we go back to Germany and talk about, so what I see, what I've already heard you say, Dr. Klugman, is that in your neighborhood, there was so much fear from many different things, but primarily the political structure under Hitler, but that you still felt extremely isolated, and everyone wasn't really, even though you wanted to go down the street to play with the gypsies, or you were interested in going into shops and seeing people who were different than you, it that fear piece sort of lived within the children in the neighborhood. How did that impact you as a child? And what made you go into the early childhood profession based on those experiences?
Yeah, well, my early childhood in take place in two places.
Mhm.
One, the city in which I was born, 4 blocks away, Hitler
Mm.
stayed when he came to the city of Nuremberg.
Mhm.
And that's one part of the story.
Mhm.
And the second part is my family.
Mhm.
My family was not religious, but they certainly scared the heck out of me
Mhm.
uh, because my grandmother was Orthodox Jew,
Mhm.
and she warned me that if I ate those frankfurters, they're going to grow out of my stomach. And my other grandmother, I would live the play life, a lot of the play life I would spend my other grandmother as well, which was another city.
Mhm.
And she got me when I was still urinating into bed.
Mhm.
And she said, if you urinate again, they're going to put you on the chain bridge that is nearby, and they will all go by and point to you and say, oh, there stands the guy who wets his bed.
Mm. Isn't it amazing and even today, some families use fear, if you don't behave, we're going to call the police. Or if you don't do that, I'm going to do something that's awful to you. That fear is used as a control mechanism for young children. And so how did those experiences, both in Nazi Germany and in fleeing right before World War II, and the stress and the fear that your family was feeling in that political climate, how did that sort of shape how you decided that you wanted to go into early childhood education? How did that sort of experience as a child make you say it can be better than this? So how did that happen? What made you think about education as a profession since you became a baker when you were in the US? How did you transition from a baker into education?
Well, it is related to the GI Bill of Rights.
Mhm.
After I came out of World War II, back to New York. And I was not going to become a Lebkuchen king. I decided I wanted to go to school and get an education, because that also carried with it a salary
Mm.
of $20 a month. And I threatened my future wife, who was my girlfriend, or became my girlfriend, in a course called The American Life and Culture. And I said to her, if you don't marry me, we're not going to get $2 increase in my salary. And so she went into early childhood,
Mm.
and I followed her because her mother was sort of the dean of the city of New York, who wrote the first daycare regulation for the Department of Health for the city of New York. They also lived right close by to the United Nations.
Mhm.
And they invited me to their apartment frequently. And so the pressure, not pressure, but what opened up was that my wife-to-be, or my girlfriend at the time, was in early childhood, nursery education, and her mother sat in a very in a leadership role
Mhm.
in the field.
Well, she was a very good woman to influence you going into early childhood education. So we're glad to know that your then girlfriend, soon to be wife, was the one who steered you into the profession. So can you tell me a little bit about after you got into the profession? I know you, Dr. Klugman, from task conferences and play conferences, and your focus on both play for young children being open-ended and freely chosen, but also your play across the lifespan. I know that when I first met you, you were very much interested not only in open-ended play and playful opportunities for young people, but that you were really thinking about the importance of play for everyone, from birth all the way through the end of life. So can you talk to me a little bit about that transition and why you thought, oh wow, play is not just important for young children, but play is important across the lifespan. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, I was always on the lookout for jobs. And I had a weekend job with a lighthouse for the blind. And at first, I taught bowling to adults. And I learned how to bowl. I never heard of bowling. And then grew into weekend trips for the younger children to the woods. I would take them on trips around New York. And I liked that idea because they let me use their station wagon and pay me. And so I got very interested in children in general. And they enjoyed having me. I enjoyed the salary I made and the opportunities that opened up as a result of the Lighthouse for the Blind. People that I knew at NYU, where I went to school, I suddenly ended up with a woman who was in charge of elementary school teachers and teacher education. And a woman named Obermeyer was an AYC in early childhood. And my wife worked with her, or my wife to be. So she introduced me to nursery education. And I eventually became an elementary school teacher. It was gender driven. You don't work with young children as a man. You work with real children They are in elementary school.
Mm.
And in elementary school, the women of the school would ask me to carry their film strip projector to their classroom. So I was in demand
Mhm.
by the workforce at whichever school I was in,
Mhm.
because I was a good carrier of 16mm projectors, which were even heavier. And then it was at a lab school in New Paltz, New York, that the head of the department of teacher education department offered me a position as a first grade teacher.
Mhm.
And I'd already been influenced by my wife and my mother-in-law, which she wasn't yet, about blocks. And I love to play with blocks.
Mhm.
Never played with blocks before. I also loved the kitchenettes that you had in classrooms. And I created a kitchenette with a water tank,
Mhm.
and children had to go get the water every morning and fill the tank so they could do the dishes. I also never played really with dolls
Mhm.
in my early life because my cousins were all girls where my grandmother lived, and they had beautiful, beautiful carriages, and they had a lot of the latest dolls.
Mhm.
When I played with them, they gave me a girl's name,
Oh
and,
my.
and the gender was getting in the way. And they called me Etgatine. And while I enjoyed it, the fact that they made fun of me
Mhm.
felt very rejecting.
Mhm.
And of course, the male side of the family did not accept me.
You know, Dr. Klugman, what I'm hearing again, though, is that those experiences that you had as a child influenced your ability to recognize the importance of including dolls and dramatic play and blocks into a primary grade classroom so that children would have opportunities that may not have been available to them in their younger years. And that is a huge piece. I mean, even today, sometimes in early childhood programs, you'll hear the girl say, or the other boys teasing another boy who might be playing with the doll. And, it's a teacher's responsibility to step into that and say, everybody can play with dolls and everybody can play in blocks. It's not based on whether you're a boy or a girl, because, and I always would say to my dads whose sons were rocking babies in dramatic play, I would say they're just practicing to be good daddies. And there's nothing wrong with that, right? And so we've got, even today, Dr. Klugman, we still have these stereotypes of who can play with what that early childhood teachers are still battling with. So can you tell me how you move from the primary grade and recognizing the importance of playful opportunities, which unfortunately have disappeared again in the primary grades because we're so worried about test scores these days and we've really lost our way and are focusing on the wrong thing. Can you tell me how then that made you interested in adults playing and then seniors playing, and what you did at Wheelock to sort of talk about that? I mean, we know you were at Wheelock for years, and Wheelock has such an amazing reputation of good early childhood practice. And so, and we know that you're now a professor emeritus at Wheelock, which is a huge privilege as well for you. But I'm curious how you made the transition from recognizing the importance of play with young people to recognizing the importance of play with all people.
Well, that bridge I crossed because of my wife
Mhm.
and the activities we engaged in with our own children. And so I learned by doing.
Mhm.
And the learning by doing came which schools my children attended and which schools my wife attended in New York City. Like the most progressive school at that time was Walden School in Manhattan, and also Lincoln School at Columbia University. And eventually I went to Teachers College, Columbia, and became a teacher educator. And the head of the teacher education department went to Wheelock College from Columbia. And the people that surrounded us, a fellow named Henry Haskell, was already into early childhood and later childhood and ran a whole camp
Mhm.
in Maine. My mother-in-law to be ran a camp that was for 3-year-olds called Camp Woodley. And Camp Woodley was filmed. A child went forth and that film influenced the field, but the family was always on top in the field of early childhood or human support, like my father-in-law was the founder of group psychotherapy and worked for the Jewish Board of Guardians in New York City and climbed that ladder both in England, where he and his wife, future wife, got a assignment from the Cambridge schools of thought, and then brought it all back to the United States.
Mm.
So it was and continues to be a very distinguished family, because my mother-in-law became the first executive director of NAAYC. And not only that, she changed it from NANE, the National Association for Nursery Education, to embrace a larger age group, and it became NAAYC.
Wow. You know, it's truly amazing the amount of strong leadership that your wife and her family had, as well as the opportunities that you took to embrace that leadership and that drove your own professional life. That their advocacy and passion for the work that they were doing with young children was infused into your own experience and the work that you did as a leader in the early childhood profession. So it is truly what a historic foundation of growth and passion for both play and for the profession as a whole, in having these family members who were deeply rooted in the profession, as well as your own leadership and your own risk-taking in pursuing what you have accomplished in your career.
Well,
so truly amazing.
Well, the total group that educated me was really the progressive education group in the New York area. And Carolyn Pratt wrote for me a book that I couldn't believe a teacher would write. I learned from children. I said, what is she doing in teaching if she's learning from children? And I couldn't believe that he could learn anything from children. That's not my background.
And isn't it amazing how much we do learn from children if we just listen and observe, if we just watch their interests and build on them, instead of trying to teach them something that we think is important?
Well, I didn't believe they had anything to offer. And suddenly, Carolyn Pratt opened my eyes when we grew things in the classroom, like carrots. They would chop off the bottom, go over, put it into a plate, and rush back over and see whether it had grown already. And that was the first time I realized what you can learn from kids. And of course, I student taught at Little Red School on Bleecker Street in New York, and went from there to other schools that were progressive in nature, like Great Neck, New York, became my first teaching job in a elementary classroom. And the principal of that school had introduced parent conferences as part of the day's work and time for it. And so I learned about children, families, through the process of the schools in which I was employed. And Great Neck was a great place for me to learn about the fact that rich people live there and very poor people. And one of the girls smelled to high heaven. And when I visited her in her home, they lived with an outhouse in a place like Great Neck. And I didn't believe it. But suddenly Steamboat Road, where poor people lived, came to focus and knocked on my door. And I knocked on their doors. And the same thing happened when I became a first grade teacher in a laboratory school in New Paltz, New York. I went to the home of a woman to visit her child and her family. And she opened the door and said, "Oh, so you are that red communist who's going to teach my child." I said, "I'm not a red communist, and I'm not about to teach your child." And I went to the principal of the school and asked him to transfer the child to another teacher who wasn't a red communist. And so throughout the career, I bumped into people who were rejecting and young children,
Mhm.
that is families. And when I came back from Afghanistan,
Mhm.
I became a principal myself in the city of Schenectady, New York, where the General Electric Company was headquartered.
Mhm.
And I learned to work with engineers whose children attended my school or schools. And Pete Seeger, brother, I don't know whether you remember Pete Seeger,
Mhm.
that was a principal up in that neck of the woods. And the small group of us sort of led the way into modern society. And from there, I created resources with the engineers that had knowledge of energy.
Mhm.
And we created solar cookers. Solar cookers at the time cost over $100, and they created with the experimental fund I was able to get from the Department of Education in Washington funding, and they created a solar cooker for $3.50
Oh my goodness.
using aluminized plastic
Mhm.
and a parabola.
And so, Dr. Klugman, did that help families then be able to feed their children? What was the purpose of the solar cookers for
Why
that
did, why were they inventing those solar cookers? What was the purpose?
The purpose was really international education,
Mhm.
because when I came back, I invited international students from the International House in New York to come to our community and spend the weekend in Schenectady. And it worked after fashion. They learned how to pull a shower curtain across instead of having the water flow out of the bathroom.
Mhm.
And we learned how to introduce them to American rural homes and how to deal with the differences in food and in activities, like a lot of Jewish families took them in and would take them to the synagogue. And much later, while I was a principal, one of the kids set the woods on fire on his playground. And you were supposed to, I don't know,
Suspend?
remember. What?
Give them a suspension? Like naked so he couldn't come to
Yeah, he wasn't allowed to come to school any longer until the parents and the child came to see me. That was the law. And the father said, look, I did you the favor of having an Afghan stay at our house and go to the synagogue, and you're punishing my child? And I said, they're two different things.
Yeah, kind of setting something on fire. So, Dr. Klugman, what I'm hearing though is that the work that you did with the engineers was then able to be shared with other international students to take back to their countries that would help the people, not only in Afghanistan, who may not have had access to things that would help them cook food in a safe way. So all of the work that you've done throughout your lifetime has benefited not only people in the US, but people in the world. And so as we're drawing to a close, I think that the amazing variety of experiences and how those early experiences in your lifetime impacted perhaps who you fell in love with, impacted the leadership that was within the family that you joined with your wife and her family, and influenced your work in such a meaningful way that you have been able to assist people everywhere, not just in the US. And that is the work that you did when you were younger, the work that you did when you went to the US, the work that you did when you were in Afghanistan, all contribute to the accomplishments that you've had in your life. And for that, we are grateful. So thank you so much for joining us today. This was amazing, and I hope we can do this again. And so for those of you who would like to know more about Porch Play Chats, please be sure to visit our website at IPA-USA.org. And until next time, keep on playing.
I'd like to